welcome this morning John Zhang, Director of the Oriental Martial Arts Center, who will take a moment to share with us this morning a little bit of the history of the performance we're about to see in honor of the Lunar New Year, which will be coming to us later in February. John.
Okay, let's skip the English greeting. We will jump straight into Chinese learning, okay? All right, Xing means new, Nian means year, Hao means good. So just say New Year good, that's all. Easy, right? Xing Nian Hao. Every year we come here and become part of your spirit and celebration here. We are so happy to come back. And the lion dance, one of the favorites in Greater Grand Rapids area, will be invited to different places, including actually Grand Rapids Ballet Company too. We were part of their show. So it's a very important, not only in China, also locally here in Grand Rapids. And the dancers are actually mostly our students and headed by our master Fang Wang. And we have live band and the two lions. Actually, we have three. Next time, if you want 3 lions, we can get all the lions come out to be part of your celebration here. Thank you. Enjoy.
Please join in the responsive reading printed in our bulletins. Life is a series of natural and spontaneous changes. Let us instead seek to allow reality to be reality.
Letting things flow naturally forward in whatever way they proceed.
The snow goose need not bathe to make itself white.
Neither do we need to do anything but be ourselves.
Good morning. Welcome to Fountain Street Church. My name is Todd Norton. My wife, Laura, and I have been attending FSC since we moved back to Grand Rapids from the Upper Peninsula 3 years ago, and we became members just this past November. We visited several area churches those first 2 years, but always seemed to migrate back to Fountain Street, just seemed right. I grew up in the evangelical church, graduated from an evangelical university, attended a Baptist seminary, and even went so far as to marry my pastor's daughter. It's safe to say I was a pretty conservative guy. But it was during our time in the UP that I began to see cracks developing in the foundation of my beliefs. I began to question why I believed the things that I said I believed. I began to read the dangerous authors such as Bart Ehrman and Bishop John Shelby Spong, those who were on the fringes of the Christian religion. And I began to spend Saturday evenings on YouTube listening to the sermons of one W. Frederick Wooden. You see, the first place I ever heard of Fountain Street Church was years before while I was in seminary. I remember well Dr. Crawford, my systematic theology professor at Grand Rapids Baptist Seminary over by Cornerstone, underscoring the importance of a proper theology by saying that when sound doctrine is thrown out the window and people are free to craft their own beliefs, their own religions, you end up with a Fountain Street Church. That was 15 years ago, and you know what? He was right, and I'm so glad of it. So glad of it. FSC is truly a unique and special place. A little over a year ago, I received a call from a friend of mine, very good friend of mine, Max. He and his wife were looking for a church where they could baptize their 2-month-old daughter, our goddaughter. Every place they checked either had doctrinal issues with infant baptism and wouldn't allow it, or required church membership before they would participate in such a program. So I said, give me a few minutes, Max, let me get on the phone with my church. And I got a hold of the events coordinator. They told us, no problem. I was kind of hoping maybe we'd just get a side room or something like that, but they offered us the sanctuary here. A few short weeks later, it was my privilege to watch as my father-in-law baptized our goddaughter right here in our beautiful, historic sanctuary in front of the steps here. That was the day that Laura and I realized we had found our church home. Fountain Street Church is truly a house of prayer for all people. We believe that everyone desires a life that's meaningful, a life that makes a difference, and a life that changes the world. Friends, welcome to Fountain Street Church. You belong here.
In the synagogue of yesterday, where I attend from time to time, there is a passage always read from what is called the Haftarah, which doesn't mean half Torah, it means the prophetic writings, which include all the books like Samuel and Kings and Chronicles. In this case, the book of Judges, which chronicles the story of Israel immediately prior to the first king, King Saul and King David. And it describes people who sat, quote, in judgment, literally were magistrates to whom the people went to settle disputes when they couldn't figure it out. And in the 4th chapter of the book of Judges, we hear about Deborah. Deborah was the wife of Lapidoth, who was a prophetess. She led Israel at that time. Let me back up and say that again. Deborah was a prophetess who led Israel at that time. She might as well have been the queen, but doesn't get a whole book. We just get that much and a little more. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah, a place between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites would come to her for decisions. You can imagine a woman of a few years, perhaps, sitting in the shade, thinking wise thoughts as people came to say, Deborah, what should I do with my crop, with my family? And she would ponder these things and yield good decisions. I have an image in my head of a grandmother, but no shrinking violet. But Israel was not safe. There were other nations around, and so later on it says, she summoned Barak, yes, and said to him, the God of Israel has commanded, go, march up to Mount Tabor and take with you 10,000 men, and I will draw Sisera with his chariots and his troops, and I will deliver him into your hands. Did you just notice what she said? You take our army there, and I'll get the enemy to come and meet you. But Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. If not, I will not go. He's scared. Very well, I will go with you, she answered. However, there will be no glory for you in the course you're taking, for then God will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. Interesting passage. I'll say more about it later. Hannah Zenesh was a Hungarian woman of Jewish parentage. They were not horribly observant, but she migrated to Palestine before the war, as the war and its reasons became more and more evident, lived on a collective farm later called a kibbutz. But when the war broke out, she decided she needed to be of service to her people left in Europe, and so she enlisted in the British clandestine services and was parachuted into her native Hungary to help destabilize that region. By the time she got there, the German Nazi government was already in charge. She was, in fact, discovered very quickly. She had a radio transmitter. I'll say more about her later, but she was a poet. And during her incarceration, during those years, she wrote this poem, Eli, Eli, my God, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rustle of the waters, lightning of the heavens, the prayer of humanity. The voice called, and I went. I went because the voice called. Well, for those of you who were here last week, I was talking about prophets and what prophets did. Throughout history, they have reminded us of what we know already, but would rather not think about, our own moral imperfections. Even when they predict the future, as we think prophets do, as they're always telling what will happen, what they're not doing is predicting some magical future, but they're kind of seeing where we'll go if our current evils are not corrected. That's really not miraculous at all. Keep that up, young man, said many a parent, and you'll be in serious trouble. Predicting something that was utterly predictable in the first place. That's prophecy. And many a child has found out just how accurate a parent can be. Their powers of observation are keen. There are several stereotypes about prophets, that they predict the future. That's one of them. They are not always, shall we say, exactly who we think we are, though. They're not always outsiders, people coming in from the wilderness with hair shirts and long hair. Often they are members of the establishment. Isaiah and Jeremiah were priests in the temple, the very top of the pyramid, short of the kingship. They are not always possessed or bizarre or crazed. Gandhi and King were highly educated and terrifically intellectual. And they're not always men. I began seminary in 1975, that's just 40 years ago. That's kind of startling all by itself. Instantly, I was surrounded with names and words I've never heard before and learned how to use things like redaction, criticism, and talk about soteriology. And my wife's favorite, because she ended up having to type one of my papers once, Religionswissenschaft. By my second year, I was a cocky fellow who knew it all. I was up to date. I was a scholar. And then a fellow student started mentioning Rosemary Radford Ruther and Mary Daly, names I had never heard before. My fellow student Sandy, an out lesbian well before being out was the thing to be, was talking to us about patriarchy and revisionist theology. I had no clue what she was talking about, but I was lucky. I was graduating. And I had a little church in rural Massachusetts where they hadn't heard of Religionswissenschaft, much less of Mary Daly, and I had little time for academic matters. But one of them did get in my consciousness, a woman still active in academic life, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, who is a scholar of biblical criticism from a feminist perspective. And through her work, I began to look again at these stories about women in the Bible and noticed that they were, shall we say, not objective accounts. She used what she called the hermeneutic of suspicion, meaning just because it's in the Bible don't mean that's the whole story. If you notice when you read the Bible, and Todd, thank you, I'm sure you're reading it even today, that there are many women, but they oddly have very little to do with the story. They're almost always props, means to an end, examples. They are not fully fledged characters. But even then, their power can sneak out around the edges if you're listening carefully. In the Torah portion this week, the part that I didn't read you, it's a long passage. It is the story of the Exodus itself, when the sea opens up and the children of Israel go through. And at the other side it says this, then Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister, Moses' big sister, by the way, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her in dance. Prophetess. Not sister only, but prophetess. The other passage I read to you about Deborah, she's a prophetess, deciding what Israel should do. Yep, she ridicules Barak for not being man enough to fight without her. And then, in fact, when Sisera, the general of the opposing army, seeing that he's losing the battle, flees, he hides in a tent. And the woman, Jael, no friend of his, welcomes him. Here, have some milk. Here, let me sing you a song. And he falls asleep. And then Jael takes a tent peg and jams it into his temple and kills him. Women are not nearly as innocent and as powerless in the Bible as we first think, are they? Judith in the Apocrypha takes the head of Holofernes in a similar way, and there are statues of her holding the decapitated general all over Europe. There are 7 prophets recognized as women in Judaism. Hannah, the mother of Samuel. Huldah, you've never heard of her, I'll bet, who predicts the fall of Jerusalem to King Josiah. Noadiah, who opposes Nehemiah's ethnic cleansing program. Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Isaiah's wife, who was unnamed but called a prophetess. Abigail, a servant of King David. And Esther. Only Esther has a book named for her, though. The rest are short stories that somehow creep into the dialogue and into the passages and subtly reveal to us the presence of women of power. It is just by coincidence that this is also the week when the gospel in the Christian church includes the passage when Mary and Joseph take baby Jesus to the temple, and where they are met by Simeon, and we heard about Simeon before, but we forget that they didn't meet just Simeon. They met up with Anna, who also acknowledged the presence of the baby as the new Messiah, and she is described as a prophetess. And later in the book of Acts, Paul says, I'm going to go stay with Philip, the evangelist, who has 4 daughters who are all prophetesses. Chances are you didn't know most of these characters' names, much less that they existed. And you didn't think some of them were prophets. And you see, that's what Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza and Mary Daly and Rosemary Radford Ruther and Philip Tribble and all sorts of other wonderful scholars have reminded us, that patriarchy, the system of the life that we live in that elevates men and subordinates women, silences them even in history. That's what patriarchy does. It erases women. For example, in a parallel way, if I were to ask you who built the U.S. Capitol or the White House, chances are you would not think African American slaves, but that's exactly what happened. We think of the architect as building this and others, but the reality is that our earliest buildings were built by African American slaves. That wasn't written down because they weren't important enough to acknowledge. We have to look for the information. Women throughout history have been treated just like that, deemed unimportant unless men decided they were worth mentioning. History, of course, is written by the powerful. And the author Dashiell Hammett once observed that the most important part of writing happens at the other end of the pencil. The eraser. Women have been erased, ignored, forgotten throughout history. Accidentally, perhaps, consciously often, it's just part of the way patriarchy marches on, oblivious to the presence and power of women. All this is interesting, of course, and it's valuable knowledge, but so far I'm giving you a lecture, not a sermon. I got to turn this into a sermon now, because every week the words of Emerson are in my head, reminding me that true sermons consist of, quote, life passed through the fire of thought. I've given you the fire of thought. Now let's pass our lives through it. And that's why last night when I was looking at my computer screen and it was laughing at me, I erased, scratched out half of the sermon I had written and all the reading I'd done all that day and said, how does this fact attach to me and to you? How do the centuries of ignored, forgotten, and erased women matter now? There are thousands of ways, innumerable ways, and so I can't give you all of them, but I'm going to pick out the prophetic power of women as we have it even hinted at in the Christian and Jewish scriptures, because that's where we have the idea of prophets. We need the prophetic power of women today, and the examples we have from the past point to what they bring if we have eyes to see and ears to hear. That's a quote from Jesus, by the way. For those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. When I look at the power, the prophetic power of women across time, 3 things have come up to me as I pondered last night in the darkness. Women speak prophetically with hope, often extravagant hope. Hannah and Mary, both pregnant with a child they did not expect, see this as proof that the coming age will be better than the present age. They take their pregnancy as omens of promise. And what do? Both of them break out in prophetic utterance like possessed women. Hannah in the first book of Samuel says, "The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength." God raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap, seats them with princes, and has them inherit a throne of honor. These same images turn up in Mary's song, but with added tones of justice. God has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble, says Mary, has filled the hungry with good things, and has sent the rich away empty. Do you understand what they're saying? They're giving hope to the poor and the powerless in their words. They are promising that the future will not be dreadful. When women speak prophetically, they don't speak to the evils of the poor, they speak to the evils of the rich, but to the worth of the poor. They do not speak to the calamities of war, they speak to the promises of peace. They are prophets of hope. Susan B. Anthony devoted her entire life to securing women's suffrage, and she died before she could cast a legal vote. When people asked her why she kept doing it, her answer was, "Failure is impossible." That's the extravagant, prophetic hope women can bring if we listen for it. They believe in things beyond the power of good sense to believe in them, and yet they will come true. And when Watergate was eating away at our national soul, who gave us hope? Barbara Jordan, with words like these. What the people want is very simple. They want an America as good as its promise. I can still hear her voice today. Parenthetically, she was the president we should have had. Women who are prophets are prophetic in their courage. Esther faced down King Ahasuerus. The story says if she goes into him without asking, she will be killed, but she goes anyway. Why? So she can intervene to stop a plot to murder the Jews of Persia. She offers her life for her people. Huldah, whom you probably don't know because she appears later in the details of Jewish history, told King Josiah, a major power, that if he continued his policies, Jerusalem would fall. She is nobody special. She has no reason to go to see him. How many kings do you know that would treat kindly someone who said, "Oh, by the way, Your Majesty, you're going to bring about the collapse of the country"? And yet she did. Neither of them had to do it. Either could have been safer if they'd shut up, but they felt they had to protect something important to them, their larger family, their communities. Says Esther, "I will go into the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Every woman who ever gave birth puts her life at risk for the sake of another life. No man ever made such a risk. In 1943, Anna Zenesh, whom I mentioned earlier, who was only 22 years old, had never had a child, was in her native Hungary as the undercover partisan she wanted to be, and she was arrested. She was tortured. She never gave up anything more than her name. The voice called, and I went. Courage as a prophetic act. Prophetic women speak with beauty, and I don't mean physical beauty of their own. Miriam did not simply proclaim the victory of God, she danced it, she sang it. Celebrating victories with song and dance is very ancient. You can see it to this day. In a world that never lacks for war and poverty, the very act of creating beauty is a prophetic act. Beauty will exist. The world will not decline and not die. Abigail, whom you may not know about, was a servant who was serving King David, who persuaded him not to commit murder. In a revisionist, subversive reading, Alice Bach said that she used her physical beauty and her intellectual powers to persuade David against a bad course, and yet David never said that he desired her in a sexual way. Abigail is one of 39 notable women in history whom Judy Chicago has portrayed in her magnum opus work, The Dinner Party, in which she created plates, goblets, flatware, napkins, and all the accoutrements of a dinner table for 39 great women through history. I've seen it. It's a beautiful piece. It took her 6 years to make it. You should, if you ever go to Brooklyn, go to the Brooklyn Art Museum. It's there on permanent display. The reason I mention this is that when you set a place at the table for someone, you're giving them reality. When you stand in front of an empty place where Huldah or Abigail or Joan of Arc is, you sense that they are real people, not just figments of some imagination. There they are. The place is waiting for them. Frida Kahlo, great artist, who spent her life in physical pain and often unable to walk, at one point said, "Feet, what do I need you for when I have wings to fly?" The prophetic power of beauty is to imagine a world so good that only beauty can gesture toward it. And even in pain, women have found reasons to believe in beauty, to create beauty, to say that beauty is worth having, even in privation. Hope, courage, beauty. Now think of all the male prophets you've known about who bring out fear, wrath, and condemnation. I know we need that from time to time. But what inspires me to keep going, after I feel the indictment of my failures, is hope, courage, beauty. And it's out there in abundance if we look and listen. Every woman in the world has a story of hope, a moment of courage, a dream of beauty. We hear about some of them with Malala Yousafzai, or perhaps Ellen Sirleaf. But the reality is that in this room, every woman has a story of hope, if we can hear it. Every woman has a moment of courage, if we are courageous enough to notice. Every woman has a promise of beauty for something, if we have eyes to see. In the world we are sharing today, can we afford to erase a single one? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my Redeemer.